big name people came in to little old Mitchell, Indiana and played in the Opera House. You know, it's just hard for me to fathom.
There are a number of important American politicians who actually get off the train and speak at the Mitchell Opera House.
Internationally known talent. The Robert Redfords and the Brad Pitts of their day. These are the people that pack big houses. And here they were coming to the Opera House in Mitchell.
Nobody is more popular than John Philip Sousa in Indiana. John Philip Sousa is the guy. John Philip Sousa performed at the Mitchell Opera House. John freaking Philip Sousa.
It's a part of our history that, a lot of towns don't have.
I just think it'll be a continuing community asset for the next 100 years.
Indiana, 1906. Teddy Roosevelt was president. Railroads were king. And the markets for coal, petroleum, and limestone were booming.
It's difficult for anybody economically to actually differentiate between where a bank begins and the railroad ends, or vice versa. Banks are railroads. And Mitchell is in the perfect place for this kind of speculative building.
You've got a town that's a pretty decent sized town. At that point in time, there was probably 4,000, 4,500 people in Mitchell, and it's not even that big now.
In August of 1900, the Southern Indiana Normal College, which contained Mitchell's functioning town hall, caught fire and was completely destroyed.
Milton Moore, president of the Bank of Mitchell and railroad speculator, vowed to recreate a place for the town to assemble.
They needed something where they could hold political rallies, they could have entertainments, school commencements, school plays, all that kind of stuff.
Virtually every small community in Indiana either built an auditorium or hoped to build an auditorium, and at least half of them named them opera houses.
The state of Indiana had allocated funds specifically for the purpose of building county halls. Milton Moore's Bank of Mitchell picked up the bonds, and the state approved a county hall for the town. This was unusual because Mitchell was not the county seat.
And it wasn't more than a week until the Bedford Democrat came out against it, that they were building this white elephant in Mitchell that was going to be an albatross around the neck of the citizens of this county.
Despite the objections from their neighbors to the north, Milton Moore and the citizens of Mitchell persevered, and on April 17th of 1906, the county hall enjoyed a grand opening headlined by the Mitchell Cadet Band.
It was indeed a treat, and we all feel a fitting christening of the county hall, of which we are justly proud. The Mitchell Commercial, April 19th, 1906.
Mitchell's new county hall was a true community center. It was a place for local minstrel acts and fundraisers, and was even a deciding factor in a presidential race.
The first day of William Howard Taft's strenuous dash through Indiana is regarded as a success by Republican leaders with the party. One of the largest audiences was at Mitchell. Mr. Taft's voice has held up fairly well, although at times it has been weak. Mr. Taft had just begun to speak when it became necessary to back the train through the crowd so the engines might be changed.
A carriage carried Mr. Taft to the Opera House, where he spoke before a swelling mass of businessmen and farmers.
Taft needs Indiana, and when Taft speaks in Indiana, he invariably will give his agriculture, the farmer, and the Republican Party and America's success, and he does just that. Taft will speak at Mitchell, Indiana, at the community center. It's remarkable.
The prosperity of the country rests usually upon the prosperity of agriculture. Just now, one of the strongest hopes of returning good times is based on the business which the farmers' crops are to afford.
The crowds are wonderful, Mr. Taft said, and the enthusiasm is a sure sign of Republican victory in November. The Indianapolis News, October 22, 1908.
It was obvious that Milton Moore's railroad investments were paying huge dividends for Mitchell.
You could go to downtown Mitchell, you could buy a ticket, and from Mitchell, Indiana, you could get to anywhere in the United States. You could go north and hit Chicago, go anywhere. You could go west, hit St. Louis, go anywhere. You could go to Louisville. You know, Mitchell was just the perfect spot.
Milton Moore was indeed a visionary for transportation, and his grandson, Menlo E. Moore, took that vision and expanded it to include the entertainment industry.
Menlo studied art at the University of Chicago and was a painter and an editorial cartoonist. In the fall of 1908, Menlo took over the operation of the county hall and rebranded it as the Opera House, having the notion to use his new Chicago connections to bring Broadway talent from New York to Chicago by way of his grandfather's railroad in Mitchell.
By 1905, there are four kinds of theaters. There are legitimate theaters, there are vaudeville theaters, there are burlesque theaters, and then there are movie houses. Menlo Moore knows that if he can book real talented people and present shows and produce shows of real talent, that'll make money.
The sort of play most people like to see. Has a plot, characters, and incidents worthy of admiration. Come in when we get to town and see what we have got. You won't be asked to stay if it don't suit you, and we'll give you your money back to boot.
The actors and actresses, the musicians, the dancers, they love to work in the Midwest because everybody in the Midwest treats them like royalty.
Evangelists came, that was the very beginning. Politicians came. There was one ad and it was all men, but they were dressed up like women, and it was called Girls, Girls, Girls. There's no TV or radio at that time, so they got together and they would go to these shows and, have a good time, and then next week go to the next one, and I can only imagine what their conversations were about.
Menlo's productions seemed to always have a flair for the dramatic. During an August 1909 performance of A Wasted Life, the supporting actor inadvertently grabbed a real knife instead of a stage knife and plunged it into the back of the lead actor. The show went on, despite an injury that narrowly missed the lead actor's heart.
The accidental stabbing, the guy was bleeding and he still kept playing. That's talent. That really
While Menlo was out hustling shows for his blossoming Southern Indiana circuit, he had a few bits of opera house-style intrigue happening in his own family.
Arna Paget is the penultimate debutante of Washington. She is a musician, she is a writer, she is an equestrian, she is a horsewoman. Charles Edward Gibson is what at the time were called oil operators, or in Southern Indiana they called them oil men. He's a day laborer out of Ohio that becomes very fortunate. He becomes a multimillionaire within months and rises to a rather unprecedented level. It would be difficult to imagine that you would find a woman as attractive as Arnie Moore anywhere in 1910. She is noticed, of course, by Charles Gibson. Gibson has made it sort of a public challenge to his associates that he can get any woman in Vincennes, and he goes about pursuing her and stalking her, and eventually he will compromise her.
While Menlo was away on travel, Gibson would send a telegram signed as Aunt Mary to announce his visit to Arnie's home. He always came through the back door, threatening Arnie with exposure should she not agree to his advances.
On October the 2nd, Menlo discovers a telegraph. The following morning, Menlo Moore seeks to confront Charles Gibson about the situation. He finds him where he believed he would be, which was on the railroad platform, the Vincennes platform. Gibson looks at Moore, brushes past him physically, moving Moore out of the way, and gives a rather vulgar expletive remark. At that point, Moore produces a revolver and fires around into the back of Gibson's head. Gibson collapses onto the platform. Moore walks up to the prone body of Gibson and fires 4 more rounds into his prone body.
Menlo was charged with first-degree murder, and he was one of the first defendants in the United States to plead guilty by reason of insanity. Since Menlo had offices in Chicago and New York, as well as business dealings with theaters throughout the country, newspapers from coast to coast carried the story.
It is Arnie Moore that saves Menlo Moore from the gallows. Arnie Moore sets him free. If you could find a more compelling witness anytime in the 20th century in legal American criminal cases, please find it for me. I'll write about that next, because this is the trial of the century, and it's happening right there in Indiana in 1910.
On December 9th, 1910, an absolute acquittal was granted to Menlo Moore in open court. A jury made up mostly of farmers exonerated Menlo based on his willingness to fulfill what his lawyers deemed the unwritten law.
This verdict is the crystallization of the purest and best sentiment of the world. It is a declaration that the honor of the wife shall be protected and the purity of the home defended. You may call it the higher law or the lower law, but it is the law that rules the human heart. And as long as this be true, no jury will ever lay its hand upon the man who fights a battle for his home. Ephraim Inman, The Indianapolis Star, December 10th, 1910.
Moore's career actually is enhanced by this tragedy. He's a hero. He's not just a hero to the women of Vincennes. He's a hero to women and children everywhere. Right? He is the most unlikely action hero of all time. He and Arnie have a second honeymoon. He brings Arnie to the West Coast and introduces Arnie to Hollywood, what will become Hollywood.
In addition to entertainment, the Mitchell Opera House continued to be a place of political significance for the state of Indiana. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party sent the son of former U.S. President and the former Secretary of the Interior, James R. Garfield, to the Opera House to help Roosevelt campaign for president once again.
On October 21st, 1912, Garfield shared the platforms of the new Progressive Party: women's suffrage, child labor laws, antitrust legislation, and labor's right to organize.
Meanwhile, after a second honeymoon with Arnie, Menlo moved his main office to the Delaware Building on 36 West Randolph Street in Chicago, where he put the business in show business.
If I enter into the tabloid field, it will be with the full realization that your show must pass those of your rival producers to succeed. Menlo Moore, The New York Dramatic World, June 29th, 1913.
Menlo Moore is one of the pioneers of what was at the time called the Chicago Field. The Chicago Field was this sense that big theater could be reduced and shown pretty much anywhere if it was professionally produced. And it was that kind of perfectionism that Moore is known for.
Menlo was a formidable showman who never seemed to slow down. He had patents for stage production devices. He wrote for stage and screen. He distributed major motion pictures like Charlie Chaplin's Sunnyside. He produced major tabloids while booking vaudeville acts throughout the country that wound up at multiple theaters, including his beloved Mitchell Opera House. Acts like John Philip Sousa, Al Jolson, and a piano player named Cora Salisbury with a sidekick violinist who later became known by the stage name Jack Benny.
Menlo speculated in entertainment in much the same way his grandfather Milton had speculated in railroads. Both made quite a fortune, and Menlo didn't forget to run his shows through Mitchell in order to make money for his family.
We were able to get these kind of acts that a lot of towns couldn't get just because we had the railroad. And so it kind of all centers around that.
In Mitchell, Indiana, you can see acts like Al Jolson. You can see Sarah Bernhardt. You can see Ed Wynn, Jack Benny. You can't see them. You can't even afford to see them in New York or Los Angeles. You have to go to one of the large, particularly New York City, to see them. Or you can just stay home and wait for Menlo Moore to bring them to the Mitchell Opera House. Guess what people do?
I asked you if you would lend me $50, but you didn't answer.
No, I thought it would be better for me to owe you the answer than have you owe me the 50. Well, what do you know? Smith's widow broke his will.
That's no news. She did it the day she married him. Hey, if this is an all-wool rug, why is it labeled cotton?
That, madam, is to deceive the moths.
Menlo was enjoying an incredible career, and then illness came. He moved his family to Los Angeles to be closer to a growing Hollywood, and in the hopes that a temperate climate would benefit his health.
He had been talking about his own death for about a month before he died, and he had visited several physicians.
On November 22nd, 1926, at 6 o'clock in the evening, in the upstairs room in which he was born, with a clear view of his beloved opera house, Menlo E. Moore, the theatrical giant who had created a show business empire that stretched from coast to coast, passed away. He was 45 years old.
His actual cause of death has been very little has been written about it, but that he died so young, and he died so quickly. By 1920, radio is already beginning to cut into the success of the community auditorium or the opera house. As I said, one of the four theaters of the time is the motion picture theater. Motion picture theaters are actually going to be built at a pace almost as great as those original community centers or opera houses were built 30 years before. The great killer of booking live shows, however, will be the Great Depression. Between 1930 and 1932, the number of shows booked into the Midwest will decline by more than half.
In the mid-1940s, the Mitchell Rotary Club decided that it was a perfect shame for the Opera House building to just sit empty.
It was kind of reborn during the World War II era, became a teen canteen. Kids could go there, they had music, they would have had jukeboxes and sock hops, and they played games.
And you might say, well, what is a sock hop? And that's where you just kick off your shoes and dance in your socks. Or they have a waltz, but most of the time they just dance to rock and roll.
My wife remembers going there after school, and on Friday nights after the ball game, they'd have refreshments for the kids and everything.
Well, you could go socialize, or you could go with that special girl or that special boy, and you didn't have to dance. You could just sit with them and maybe just take an hour or two to be with that special someone where otherwise you wouldn't have somewhere to go.
In the late 1950s, the Opera House was repurposed once again.
It became truly Mitchell City Hall at that point in time. They ripped out the seats and all that kind of stuff. They hoisted up the stage and put it up in the rafters, cut big gaping holes in the west side of the building, put fire trucks in there, and people went in and paid their water and sewer bills and talked to the mayor.
As you go in the front door on the left, there was just the water department, and the area out there was just the one big room. And then eventually they built stuff for the police department and everything in there.
I got married in 1961, And I remember going there and paying my water bill for several years.
The big center steel pipe held the balcony up at one time. If we had more than one prisoner or one person, we'd handcuff them to that pole, put their arms around them, you know. And this one fella decided that if he took his shoes and socks off, he could climb that pole and get out of there. Well, we came out of the police station, we was talking to the other guy, and there's this guy about halfway up that pole with no shoes or socks on and still handcuffed to the pole.
It's just amazing that you paid your water bill where you used to go and sock hop and dance or just to mingle with your friends.
In the late 1970s, the city of Mitchell built a brand new city hall, and the Opera House sat empty once again, waiting to be discovered.
My brother was in the IU theater department, going through college, and he wrote a paper on the Mitchell Opera House. And one of his professors said, you know, you really need to step in and restore that.
And Opera House Inc. was born, and through the work of the Hartzell family and the Mitchell Grissom Kiwanis Club and citizens at large, they raised a lot of money.
Doug was pretty free, made his own way, eventually got into directing and producing plays in St. Louis and mainly Chicago, and was really put his heart and soul into that.
And he had a dream, I think, that a lot of people didn't see at the time because it was pretty well run down at the time, and he thought by putting something together he could make something work here in Mitchell.
Burris Elementary School was being torn down, and it had a balcony, so they were able to use that balcony and bring it into the Opera House because the former balcony was gone. So it was, you know, a pretty community-wide effort to get it back and going again. And
growing up, for me, it was City Hall. That's where the mayor's office was, and clerk, treasurer, police, so forth. Seeing that space for the first time, I had no idea that there was all of that extra space there.
Like Menlo Moore before him, Doug Hartzell located in Chicago and brought shows from the Windy City back to his hometown opera house. He had a lot of help from his community and his family.
Mom and Dad were really the boots on the ground, booking the shows and taking tickets, selling tickets. People put many, many hours into that.
I always enjoyed talking with Peg over the phone, and we would talk all over the details, and then I'd mail her the copy, and they were just a sweet couple.
In the mid-1980s, it was hard to find a seat on a Saturday night. But in the midst of this new life for the Opera House, tragedy struck once again.
Doug died first. He was in Chicago and had some liver difficulties, and so he died.
If it wasn't for him, who knows what would have happened with the Opera House.
Peg had arthritis so badly she wasn't able to hardly get out of bed, but she still got on the phone and she booked those acts laying in her hospital bed.
My father passed away and my mom became ill and went into assisted living, and I jumped in and helped her out, be her legs and feet. Kept it running for another year.
In the late 80s and early 90s, Mitchell suffered an economic downturn. Several major employers left the area. In spite of the difficulties, the Opera House and its rich history has remained a point of community pride.
This is Mitchell. This is who we are. No one's better than anybody else. We are here together.
We started out by having community meetings, and some of the focuses, you know, people divided up into groups on what was most important to them. And one of those was the Opera House.
The town keeps saying, we want our Opera House. We want this up. We want it rehab. We want it functioning.
On October 21st, 2014, the city of Mitchell deeded the Opera House to Hoosier Uplands, an area nonprofit economic development group that had taken on a number of restoration projects in surrounding counties.
Our plan is to, of course, renovate it, get it in operation, and our plan then is to have live entertainment shows every Saturday night.
Just say what I could say.
Southern Indiana, we're really fortunate to have a lot of buildings that have not fall into the wrecking ball.
Too nice to tear down, too nice to be a parking lot, and we would much rather convert it to a community asset and give Mitchell something to be proud of.
For a lot of the people that grew up in this area that have an attachment to the building, they'll be able to come and see that it was restored, and it'll be in good shape to pass on to future generations.
That old building has never experienced what it's experiencing now.
Saving the Opera House is a community effort. I want to see the town fill up on Saturday night again as they try to get to the Opera House.
Just see what I could see.
There's a lot of dreams that can be promoted, developed with our Opera House, and we hope to do that.
I'm just looking forward to it opening back up.
256 days after the city of Mitchell deeded the building to Hoosier Uplands, a grand reopening, coinciding with Independence Day, occurred on July 4th, 2015. Once again, Mitchell had its crown jewel back in full swing for present and future generations to enjoy.
There's something about the size and shape of that building that is roomy but intimate. It seats a fair number of people.
The acoustics are fairly good.
Acoustics are great. You don't even have to have the sound in there. You just stand on stage and sing.
Plenty of room.
I know that we're booked out until like September so far right now, and I've been researching these people on social media and the internet, and I'm listening to these people sing, and I think it's gonna be great.
It's not over. I cannot see that the best days of this town are behind us. I still think they're ahead of us. I genuinely believe they are.
The best days are ahead for this building.